Okay, welcome everyone to History 264, Orthodox Judaism in the United States. On our syllabus is the Revel Revolution. We've augmented to History, Legacy, and Resonance. I am absolutely delighted to co-teach with three incredible leaders, incredible professionals, and people whose entryway into Bernard Revel is unique, important, and I think will yield a lot of creativity. So first is President Emeritus of Yeshiva University, Richard Joel, who I hope will talk about when he went through the Revel's papers in the YU archives as a source of inspiration. Dr. Alan Kadish is president of Touro College and University System, and as we'll find out, Revel in 1915 founded the Talmudical Academy, MTA, which Dr. Kadish is a graduate of. And Dr. RIvka Schwartz is a historian, certainly a historian of science and the United States. She is a principal at SAR High School. All four of us, I shouldn't speak for myself, but three people are really senior thinkers and leaders in Jewish education on different levels, and in some ways are heir to a conversation that Revel started. Bernard Revel, a brief timeline of his early life. He wasn't known as Bernard when he lived in Europe. Dov was born to Rabbi Nachum and Leah Revel of Prieni, near a little suburb near Kovno. And very early on, Dov was identified as the Prenner Eloi, an absolute genius, none other than Yitzchak Inspector, very foretelling of the institution that he would once lead, was the first to identify him as a small child, about 6 years old, as a major rabbinical mind, studied in the local Klois, that's essentially a base medrash. And then, really because unfortunately his parents died young, was sent to learn in the Telz Yeshiva nearby, also in Lithuania. Parents died, father and mother respectively, in 1897, then in 1903. And while in Telz, we don't know much about his early life, and of course, much of what we know was offered to us by Rabbi Kefet when he was Arnold Rothkopf, wrote a book, Bernard Revel, Builder of Orthodoxy, his dissertation at Revel Graduate School, no less. What we do know is that somehow, some way, he accessed Haskalah literature in the Telz Yeshiva, and we don't know what he wrote exactly, but in 1905, he, according to Rabbi Kefet, he was arrested because he had printed contributions to the political and social unrest. It was the Russian Revolution of 1905. He's released from prison in 1906, and then now transforming into Bernard, although did go by Dov sometimes. Bernard Revel migrated to the United States where he had family. 1909, he marries Sarah Travis of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a very wealthy oil family, and he earned a master's degree from NYU, spent time in Philadelphia at Temple University with the so-called chief rabbi of Philadelphia, Bernard Leventhal. Bernard's apparently hung out together. He earns a master's degree in Judaic Studies from NYU in Rabbinics. In 1911, he is the very first recipient of a doctorate from Dropsy College, also in Philadelphia. 1915, age of 30 years old, Rabbi Dr. Bernard Revel is elected president of Yeshiva, Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, what by the 1940s would be known as Yeshiva University. Just so we can understand him in his own descriptors, in a 1920 affidavit that I just happen to have on my Dropbox, Rabbi Revel was testifying in a Cleveland, Ohio court case about Mechitza in a battle between Orthodox and conservative Judaism. Just to get a sense of his temperament, the questioner asks, what training have you had in Judaism? Responds Revel, I received training from my father, who was a rabbi, and in the yeshiva of Telz. Were the principles of the book that you published for your PhD at Dropsy on Smicha? No, on sectarian law, published on Karaite literature. And you are at present time of what institution? I'm not a practicing rabbi, but head of the faculty of the Yeshiva Rabbi Isaac Elchanan, generally known as the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. And how long have you occupied the position? Like he said, 1915. Later on in the deposition, he asks, the questioner asks, what other training have you had in Judaism aside from that stated? Responds President Revel, studying and living it for many years. Finally, and this really speaks to his humility, questioner asks, the lawyer asks, do you claim to be an authority on Judaism generally? Hard to say. Let others say it. And so that's what you have. By all accounts, by his contemporaries, Rabbi Revel was a modest person, somebody whose charisma spoke for itself, was not somebody who needed to stand out, but he certainly did. He shined quite bright. And this is really where I want to open it up for a conversation and to offer context, is that Bernard Revel and his mission, his revolution, which I should say extended all the way to where I am here in Chicago and inspired a number of immigrant rabbis to found the Hebrew Theological College around the same time. It was called the New York Yeshiva and the Chicago Yeshiva. I'm contractually obligated to pronounce it Yeshiva. But they're not doing it in a vacuum. So just to map it out, things that we already know is that in 1917, Sarah Schneer found Beis Yaakov in Krakow. In 1924, Rabbi Meir Shapiro lays the cornerstone of Chachmei Lublin Yeshiva. And in 1929, again, all in this interwar period, Mizrahi establishes not exactly a school setting, but B'nai Akiva. And so what I want to ask is, and we'll go to our screen over here. You have a lot of people, a lot of really thoughtful people thinking about Jewish education at a moment of political and social upheaval. In our time, and we'll look at Dr. Revel's sources and some of his writings. In our time, do we look too monolithically at models? Should we expand ourselves? You have one very bright woman thinking about something in Krakow. You have other Mizrachis thinking about something in Eretz Yisrael. You have a new yeshiva with a dormitory, no less, about to open in Lublin. Do we think enough multipliers about Jewish education today? So let's unmute our panelists to make sure that they're around. Anyone?
We're now behaving like my class does on Zoom.
So look, there are a lot of people, I think, thinking about Jewish education, and for much of the last decade, up till recently, perhaps the conversation's changed a little bit. There was a lot of thought about Jewish continuity and what we can do to ensure Jewish continuity, and how to do Jewish education for the larger community was the backdrop. A lot of that thought about continuity. I think that the Jewish intellectual tradition in 2020 is pretty diverse, and people have different ideas about how to do it. I think, is there a need for new ideas? There are a lot of people who suggest that, and a lot of people are working on things. I don't think anything yet has taken over replacing the traditional model. There's a recent study done about the American Jewish community, which looked at creative models of Jewish engagement, and education was a piece of that. But the jury's still out on how well these newer models of education can really engage Jews in the long term.
I think one issue is that you're positing a definition of Jewish education and are people talking to each other. I think what's different isn't so much how we view the other, but how accessible each other is. It's kind of hard to speak to only one community because everything is accessible. And to some degree, it even intimidates one from being too bold in one's thoughts because you're being scrutinized by so many different thoughts. I just wanted to say it a little differently. Zev, you kind of define Jewish education without defining it.
No,
and,
right.
And you're defining, and I think it might be a too narrow term because I don't think the question that we ask is about how are we doing Jewish education. That's a fine question, but it's a narrow one. I think when you look at Dr. Revel, he was talking about how do you keep Jews Jewish and why? And education in a formal way is a component of that. My daughter is what's called an experiential Jewish educator, so I have to be very careful in my definitions of education. But certainly if you look at the world in a broader way, the challenges of how do you create the next generation of Jews for a Jewish Renaissance, you have to look beyond the narrowest of definitions of Jewish education.
So I'm cognizant of the potential for a sort of blind man and the elephant problem here, which is that each one of us speaks about the slice of things that we see. So I want to be pretty clear about what's the slice of things that I see. I work in SAR High School, which, as I like to say, is in the modern Orthodox wing of the modern Orthodox community. And I have lived for the past 20 plus years in Washington Heights. My husband's Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, so I've had a chance to see that world up close and personal as well. And I think from that twin set of vantage points, I would disagree with Dr. Kadish. And I would say that I don't actually see us being in a time of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I see us as something that I think is a function of increasingly centralized rabbinic authority, which speaks to something that President Joel was saying, which is that everybody everywhere knows about and can weigh in on and comment on what everybody is doing. But in the yeshivish world, that means institutions, including Dr. Kadish's institution, have to navigate and negotiate with the guidelines that are being set out by one set of Rosh Yeshiva. And in the modern Orthodox world, all institutions, including my institution, have to navigate and negotiate with, if not guidelines, then pronouncements or concerns raised by another set of Rosh Yeshiva. And what that means is that it's difficult to range too widely off of those accepted lines. There is a great deal of creativity from people who don't have to care what those lines are. So if you go to Yeshivat Hadar, to people who are outside the definitional lines of orthodoxy, they have a lot of space to be creative and different. But for people who are operating within the institutional lines of orthodoxy, especially in the like New York to Lakewood megalopolis, where maybe our actions are more scrutinized and more under the microscope because we're closer in to where the seats of authority are, there are external constraints on the range and the amount of on the amount of creativity and variability within orthodoxy. The kind of thing that Sarah Schneer did, which really was to start something radically different and then wait for the mainstream to kind of catch up with her and give her the okay a while later, is a tougher thing to pull off right now for various institutional reasons.
So just so we understand where to give content and to give flesh to the bones, what Revel was up against also was against the culture of America. The idea that, again, this immigrant population, and just to give a sense of his moment, in 1880, there were about 250,000 Jews living in the United States. By 1900, so around when Revel migrates to this country as a relatively young man, there are about 1 million Jews, Jewish women and men living in the United States. By 1920, when the shores were closed to most, there was a rabbinic exception in the law that allowed for a certain number of immigrant rabbis. So by and large, most migration was cut off in the mid-1920s. There were about 3 million. So it's growing exponentially, is the American Jewish community. And the thought is that if we're going to Americanize and if we're going to make it in this country, then the golden citadels of the public schools are going to be the agent of acculturation. And that's why Alexander Dushkin, writing in 1918, writes, there is no doubt that the Jewish parochial school, we today call it the day school, is the easiest, most alluring method of preserving Jewish religious life in this country, or at least a certain type of Orthodox, Dushkin was not Orthodox Jewish life. To subject the Jewish child completely, to subject, you can already tell he has an angle, completely to Jewish influences, and not to permit the give and take process between him and his non-Jewish neighbor may be a temporarily effective way of making sure of the child. But it is fraught with danger for America and for the American Jew. The Jews of this country have realized that they cannot plan for the education of their children without taking into account the whole problem of their adjustment in America. So the day school, and I want to really look at Jewish education on the day school and also on the college level. And we can look at it in outside the classroom, inside the classroom, camping, everything is up. Revel's legacy is specifically, though, in the day school and in undergraduate education. This is what he's up against. This idea, this notion that if you create the day school, you are subjecting a dominant American immigrant Jewish population to a life of insecurity, to a life where of a certain low ceiling for financial and social opportunity. Just to give you a sense of what else is going on, City College, not too far away. The sense was you either got into City College or you looked for a job in the post office. The numbers are a little sketchy, but in the 1920s, about 80% of City College on 137th Street was all men. Were Jewish, 80%. Some people think that number was closer to 90%. And in its sister school at Hunter College, about 40% were Jews. I'm going to open it up again for a conversation, but one person that I want to introduce everybody to is Solomon Th Horowitz. Not many people know about Dr. Horowitz. That's because he died in the Spanish flu pandemic. Somebody who his legacy ought to resonate along with Revel in our time. And obviously, for everybody who's affected right now, our thoughts and prayers are with them. Horowitz comes as the founding principal of the Talmudical Academy. Revel, before he becomes the president of a pretty traditional yeshiva, maybe offering a couple of components of Haskalah, of Jewish history, of Jewish thought, of Tanakh, but not very different from a curricular standpoint from a traditional yeshiva. His first move to acculturate his program to American norms is the Talmudical Academy. It was known as just TA until you had a B, and so you had a Brooklyn branch that became MTA. Now it's the Yeshiva University High School for Boys, and its founding principal is Solomon Th Horowitz, who acknowledges Revel in this quotation, and specifically in Revel's courage to embrace America qua America. And we're going to look at some of the sources, but it's very, very clear. I put on that slide earlier on that it's happening intercontinentally. It's happening with the Lublin Yeshiva. It's happening with Beis Yaakov and Sarah Schneer. It's happening with not just Bnei Akiva, but other schools in Mandatory Palestine, in Israel. Revel's gambit is that if his school can embrace a culture of America, that his school is going to be successful. He has many, many immigrant young boys or sons of immigrants. Does the rhetoric around America still work in contemporary education?
I'm somebody who teaches a high school level class on American citizenship and is part of 3 different research projects about teaching American citizenship in high schools, and particularly obviously in Orthodox high school, Orthodox Jewish high school, which is where I work. And until we, like many other Americans, in the aftermath of the 2016 election and what it revealed about divides in our community and our society, started turning back to talking about Americanness and American citizenship, we talked about Americanness almost not at all in my high school. And it was actually something that was interesting to me when we started to pay attention to it, and I became conscious of it. We are a modern Orthodox high school with an open orientation towards the world, and we always used to talk to our students about contributions that they would make to the Jewish community and the broader world. We never stopped and said to the country you live in, to American society. That was never a stopping off point in the conversation. The conversation was always the Jewish community and the world. We taught them American history very well, but we really never spent a lot of time talking to them about how they feel and think and engage as citizens. And that reflects a broader pattern in this country of disinvestment in citizenship education and civics education, which has been happening generally since the 1960s or so, in which a lot of people are now realizing we are reaping the benefits or the harms of and need to reverse. So this whole talk about being an American and what it means to be American and Americanness really, I think, largely has disappeared from our communal discourse. We talk about our kids being absorbed in the mass culture and the popular culture of the broader world, or whether we like that or we don't like that, but not specifically as there being some sort of American identity that they can take on or not take on. And it's really only in the last few years that we've returned to that conversation of what it means, particularly to be an American and an Orthodox Jew, and how are we helping our kids think about that and navigate that.
Well, it's a little bit like the issue facing the Jewish community over the span of a century, which is our term for it was assimilation, right? And originally we welcomed assimilation. The great thing for us to do in the Golden Medina was to be able to benefit from America. And I think Dr. Revel in his earliest days, in fact, didn't want that assimilation, but wanted us to be a part of what today we call American exceptionalism. But if you look at the different generations represented here, we were all aware of our Jewishness when we came to America. Our parents or grandparents assumed that Yiddishkeit would kind of osmose into us as it had into them. And the next generation thought the same. So since there wasn't an investment in Jewish living and in Jewish learning, we got more and more distant from our Jewishness. I think there's been a similar pattern in terms of how the American body politic related to its Americanism, and concomitantly how the American university has dealt with a value orientation as the whole picture of America has changed. When I grew up, and I'm probably the most senior person here in the group, I say with no great affection, except nobody touched me because of the coronavirus. When I grew up, I spent my first years of life in public school. It was a time where I think I can speak for Jews. Most of us felt in America that we were a third of the population. There were Catholics, there were Protestants, and there were Jews, particularly in New York. And when I was in public school in the late 50s, I remember the Christmas pageant. And the Christmas pageant then got broadened because in addition to Adaste Fidelis, we sang Se vivon sof 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 and Ma'oz Tzur. And just as I learned the Latin, the rest of the students learned the Hebrew. And there was something very celebratory about that. I remember when I was in 6th grade, my mother and father, may they rest in peace, cooked 600 potato latkes and brought them on warmers to Public School 13 so that during the season there could be a Hanukkah party as well. We grew up very naturally every day saying the Pledge of Allegiance, having, in my instance, it was a moment of silent devotion. I remember in public school at 2 o'clock on Wednesdays, my Catholic friends went to religious instruction in the Diocese of St. Denis, and my Rebbe would pick us up in his little Studebaker, and we'd go to our shul where we would have choir practice for the Yomim Noram. So it was, and I remember our friends who were Catholic having Fridays when they wouldn't eat meat. And it was that kind of world. From the 60s on, it got, as the world got smaller, we became more anonymous and more distended, and we became more a part of a political correctness. As RIvka said, the world also has gotten much smaller now. You know, in the 19th century, the people of Pinsk never knew what the Rav of Minsk poskined. It wasn't a problem. Right? So I think with that, that change, Americanism doesn't mean much now. Do our kids say the Pledge of Allegiance? I don't know. I work very hard on Thanksgiving to do a Thanksgiving Seder where we sing America the Beautiful, so I make sure that all my grandchildren know it. But this notion of what's special about being American has been more, again, osmosed into nothingness. And without being too political, the last 3 years and several years before that have smashed any notion of elegance and civility and concern and comedy. So I think the same thing has happened in education. Back to your question, I think, of course, I don't think Dr. Revel said, how do we embrace America because that's who we should be? I think Dr. Revel, very much ahead of his time, said, first and foremost, ich bin a Yid, I'm a Jew, but I'm in this country of exceptionalism. I'm in this place whose founding principles are not only sympathetic, but share a lot with our founding principles, because as Rabbi Sachs is always prone to say, right, the United States is really based in many ways on to some degree Torah principles. And I think in starting his educational mission, Dr. Revel thought that Jewishness could influence America. One last thing I'll say, and I'm sure we'll get to it. I grew up with the notion of melting pot. The great thing for all the different components of American life to do was to take their particularism. We were gonna make a great cholent. And I was gonna take the carrot, who I was, and throw it into the great melting pot. And we would end up with a delicious cholent, but you couldn't see my carrot when you looked into it. People sometimes say that the Canadian community did it differently, and they embraced the notion of a tossed salad. That I throw my carrot in and it becomes a tossed salad and everyone enjoys it, but you can still find the carrot. I think Dr. Revel never accepted the notion of melting pot, didn't think it was the sine qua non of being strong in America. I'll be quiet now, I'm sorry.
I think, Richard, you've hit on a really important point, which is that this conception of a melting pot and our idea about it in American society has oscillated over the past few decades. There was the idea initially that we were going to create a melting pot. Then individual group thinking was celebrated, and the idea that these individual groups would somehow interact together to create a better society became sort of 20 or 30 years ago, I think, the common idea of what people were looking at. I think now we have to reevaluate this, because I agree with you that civics and politics, I think everyone would agree, has degenerated markedly. And so I think we have to rethink the idea about identity politics, how we relate to each other, and how we find common ground. What's been particularly, I think, disappointing about what's gone on in the past month or so is that whatever one thinks of the way we approached the world after 9/11, there was a sense of unity and Americanism that took over the country that maybe we abused a bit, but for at least a time brought us together. And what's happening now seems to be a whole lot of finger pointing. And so I think to the idea of civic culture of America and common American values is one that's hard to frame in terms of Jewish education, simply because those common values, I think, are much less sure and much less consistent than they were when Revel was around, although that was a more complicated time in some ways. But certainly when we were growing up, when we sort of felt that there was an American ethos and values, and as you said correctly, that we shared a lot in the Jewish tradition with those values. The other challenge, of course, has to do with what's happened, I would say, mostly in the past decade, which is when I was in school, I think I could feel that the values that I learned in Jewish education in many ways overlapped with prevailing culture. Sure, there were some important differences, particularly after the late 60s. But in many ways, my peers who weren't observant Jews, and maybe not Jews at all, had similar goals and aspirations and ideas to what observant Jews has. And in the last decade in particular, that's changed a lot. So the idea of finding a synthesis of values, I think, is challenged from 2 points of view. I'm not sure there's a synthesis in America for us to relate to. And to the extent that there is a politically correct culture, I think it's more divergent from observant Judaism than it has been for much of the history of the United States. So it's challenged to try to achieve that synthesis and try to find the right balance. But I agree completely with RIvka that we have to do a much better job teaching civics, not just in Jewish schools, but in the United States overall, because we're living in a fractured society, and we've seen, I think, in the past month, the dangers of that.
Well, as a college president, I know that I had the issue. I was once speaking to an Ivy League president, and I said, what do you do in your curriculum to talk about not particular values, but about the value of values? And what are the values that we share? And this particular individual said, well, we don't do that. We teach critical thinking, and we teach diversity. And I think it goes to a point, when I was being selected to be president of Yeshiva University, some of the people there were concerned because they heard I was a pluralist, and that concerned them. And I told them it shouldn't concern them. We should all be pluralists, because a pluralist is not a relativist. We are living at a time now, as Alan points out, where culture is kind of saying you all have to bow down to a correctness, and I'm not even talking political, just the correctness of individualism, of opposition to anorthodoxy. To me, to be a pluralist is not about being a relativist, it's about being tolerant. It's about my being able to respect and protect your right to be wrong. And that allows us to have more common discussions. I'm also not sure that America has gone so far away. I think those of us who live in New York or in the second city have a much more intensified view. I would always tell my students, and unfortunately my children listen to me, that not New York is a great place to live and to be Jewish.
So if you take a look, and I want to reframe our conversation just a little, pivot just a little bit, and here's some of Revel's sense of what his own words, true Americanism is, for everybody put it on your screens. Absolutely the case that Will Herberg made an absolute fortune with his essay, Protestant Catholic Jew, which appeared in 1955, which, as President Joel rightly points out, every kid thought that Jews represented a third of the American population. And it's borrowed from Horace Kalin and this idea of pluralism and melting pot theory. But I do want to take back to something that RIvka had said, that Dr. Schwartz said just a moment before that, is that something happens. We alluded to it. Dr. Kadish also pointed out that the 60s changed things. And from my point of view, it changed in two respects. Number one, the sexual revolution in Vietnam of the 60s created major upheaval. And then in what scholars call the long 60s into the Nixon resignation, certainly placed a certain level of distrust in the executive in the White House. But also there's Israel. Meaning, what Dr. Schwartz pointed out is in the last couple of years is a need to reckon with the contested notions of Americanism in a way that Revel certainly did not nearly in the 1920s. So number one, is there a value and a need to put the pieces back together for our students to talk about the value of values, but also is that this is even not MTA or TA comes on the scene in 1915. That's before the Balfour Declaration. Does the rise and the very great importance of Israel, does that push questions of civics, of America, of good old-fashioned Declaration of Independence rhetoric. Do they have equal footing? Does it decrease the value of discussing America? And also, just to return to what Dr. Schwartz had reminded us, is that it's not so much a question of preaching American values, but, and I think all three and all four of us, I should add myself into this, have alluded to this, have referred to this, is the need to address competing American values.
Well,
So
go ahead, Rivka.
I want to say two different things here, and I'll try to say them quickly. The first one is about Israel and the way Israel plays into this. I mentioned that I'm involved in 3 different initiatives relating to civics education. One of them is an incredible organization called Civic Spirit that was actually spearheaded by the former vice president of Yeshiva University, by Robert Hurt, and his wife, Virginia Bear Hurt. And that is about bringing civics education specifically into religious schools. And so the original cohort that got this off the ground was educators from 6 Jewish schools and 6 Catholic schools coming together for an intensive summer week of study around American civics and citizenship to prepare us to go back to our respective schools to teach about civics and citizenship. And there was so much that came out of that was so fascinating. We could talk about just that for a long time. But one thing that was fascinating was the point at which we said to the Catholic school educators, actually in our schools, we have to be careful because it's seen as a negative to be too rah-rah about American citizenship, too patriotic and American, because isn't your first loyalty, or at least a great loyalty, supposed to be to Israel? Aren't you supposed to teach your kids aspirational Zionism? And that's really where Jews belong. And that blew the Catholic school teachers' minds. The idea that our parents would see it as a negative if we were too invested in our American citizenship, because there's this whole other set of values that has us looking elsewhere, oriented elsewhere, with commitments elsewhere. Obviously, the Catholic school educators could not wrap their brains around that, but that very much shapes how we do and don't talk about and think about American citizenship in a way that was not a reality for Dr. Revel before the founding of Medina Israel. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. Second thing I wanted to say about what leads people to turn away from this unified American narrative in the 1960s. And you mentioned, Dr. Elif, the sexual revolution, the lack of trust and authority that comes around as a result of some political scandals, Vietnam. But there's something else that I think we need to talk about, and that plays into some of the earlier discussions about Americanness and shared American values, which is that it's important to say that that period of civil agreement and ability to discuss politics, and at the end of the day, we're all on the same side, is true if you're a white American. And if you're a Black American, in many parts of the country, you are not a person whom the law protects. You do not have civil rights. You cannot vote. To the extent that there's an important political science work called Paths Out of Dixie, which suggests that America should be seen as a democracy only since 1965. Only since the passage of the Voting Rights Act that meaningfully guarantees the franchise for every American are we a democracy, which for my students is like a crazy way to reframe this, because it means that we're not the world's oldest democracy. We're actually an emerging and very young democracy, which has you think about things in a very different way. And maybe part of what leads to the fraying of this fabric of an American story is when people say, well, we told this American story about the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and all men are created equal, and that's really beautiful and inspiring. But when we think about the historical reality of that time, of the framers, of the founders, of right now in 1965, there's a giant disconnect there. And maybe people lose trust in that story because they come to see that story is not true. And when I talk about teaching citizenship to my students, it is with a recognition. It is like how do we build a kind of warts and all citizenship narrative? One that doesn't deny all of that, that doesn't build comedy or political agreement, or we can all get along on the backs of we've written a certain percentage of the population out of the American body politic, but how do we create a narrative and a way of educating and thinking about citizenship and Americanness, which tells all of those stories, includes all of those people, and finds a way to build a narrative and a fabric of citizenship from all of that.
Right, and just Kevin Schultz's Tri-Faith America, which Oxford published in 2011, makes your exact point, which is that the idea that you Protestant, Catholic, Jew, it breaks down when the question of race really emerges as the focal issue in the mid-1960s.
So the first question that you raised that Dr. Schwartz spoke about a little bit is how does the existence of Israel change your idea of allegiance to America? And I don't see it as having dramatically altered the way we do the United States. I think what I see it as having dramatically altered perhaps the way we see the Jewish people. And to the extent that that mirrors into our feelings about the United States, I guess you could say it alters that as well. But I think for many, at least until recently, the success of Israel was a tremendous source of pride. And I would say for most Orthodox Jews, that feeling persists. And certainly after 1967, there was a dramatic increase in our willingness to say, we have something special to offer. We have success that we can point to. We have a source of pride. The Economist wrote a long article about the 67 war, and the Economist had the British publication had very different views about Israel then as it does now. But the last line in about a 20-page article was, for the Jew to be able to walk around the world and hold his head up high, that is indeed something new. And I think for those of us who have only our consciousness of what happened since 1967, I think for all the success that Jews had in the United States before 1967, something fundamentally different happened after the 67 war, although perhaps it began with the creation of Israel. And I think it's led to a group of people who are more willing to stand up for ourselves. One can argue that the movement to free Soviet Jewry, which some people on this call were instrumental in, was possible only because of the 67 war and the pride of activism in Israel that it created. So I think it's become a fundamental tenet of Jewish identity. Even now, when there's more controversy in some parts of the Jewish community about Israel, the idea of Israel has become a more fundamental part. But I don't think it detracts from the way people view the United States. And I haven't seen that. If anything, people want to become more involved because of the strong relationship between the United States and Israel and the dramatic impact that American politics can have on Israel. I think you see a lot more activism among Jews in American politics, Jews of all stripes on all sides of issues, than you might have without the existence of Israel. I think it's actually made us more citizens rather than less.
I'd like to take a little bit of a contrarian approach to this, because it's interesting to me that in all of Dr. Revel's 8 or 9 commencement addresses for Yeshiva College before he passed away, there is no mention of Israel, there's no mention of Palestine, there's no mention of Zionism. And I think some of that and our being an exilic people made it more fortuitous to be able to think about what the contribution of the Jew to the world is. And I think if you look at Dr. Revel, so much of what he's doing is not saying Jews become more American. He says, Jews, look at our Jewishness. How can we thrive in America, and how we contribute to the ethos of America? One could argue that in some ways, the Jews' commitment to all the midos, all of the attributes of what Jewishness is, bein adam l'chavero, even bein adam la'atzmo, were a little bit hijacked by the Zionist enterprise. And I don't mean in a bad way, but for the first time, the attention of secular Jews and all Jews was diverted to say, you really want to know what Judaism's about? Look at the state of Israel and the role we can have and the pride we can get. And I tell you that federations were collusive with that, because in looking to say, how do you get Jews to be stronger Jews? You know, let them give to Israel. The state, the Medina, was certainly collusive in that because it needed the support. And I just find it very interesting that you don't seem to find many voices like Bernard Revel today who approach our lives as saying that our Jewishness mandates that we get to work in a harmonious synthesis with worldly values. If I can be pedantic, Zev, and if you look at Dr. Revel's article on Jewish education that you were so kind to include with everyone, and on page 11, just one paragraph, if I might, because I think it focuses it. Is that all right?
Please do, please do.
All right, so he says something interesting. The supreme task of Jewish education is the building up of a complete Jewish personality. This task is indeed not an easy one. In the face of all the factors antagonistic to traditional Judaism, the social and economic forces, this is 1926, by the way, the social and economic forces, the secular school with its Protestant undertone, the secularized home, and even our partly secularized seminaries. While not ready to advocate a system of day schools for all our Jewish American youth, I firmly believe that our hope to secure the foundation of Jewish life in this land lies in the day school, where Jewish learning, the Jewish outlook on life and ideals are on the same plane of importance and dignity as general culture. Schools which aim to develop not alone the mind, but also the heart and the will of the student to live as a Jew, where the Jewish conscience and the where the Jewish conscience and the human conscience are developed harmoniously into the synthesis of the Jewish soul. He wasn't even saying we have a duty to become like Americans. He's saying here's an opportunity for us to be full Jews. And there's no talk here of how do we develop in such a way that we can go off and learn Yomam V'Layla. In fact, there is the notion that being able to learn gives us the fuel to know how to fuse all that we learn into a Jewish personality that would influence the world.
And what about this phrase? And this is, I'm going to share the last slide. Here's a letter he writes to Nathan Isaacs upon the founding of Yeshiva College. But if you take a look at the next, is this idea that Bernard Revel bequeaths to us this language of harmonious blending and of synthesis. And here is the visual. This is what Revel had envisioned would be Yeshiva College in Washington Heights. What he didn't understand was that in a year from then, you would have the Great Depression, the onset of it. This right here, if you can see my screen, is the one building in Zeisman Hall, I believe. What of that language combined with this combination language, which we all reckon with, whether it's synthesis, whether it's Torah Umada, Torah Va'avodah, which is obviously the Israeli iteration, this idea of combination language, which was so much a part of Dr. Revel's discourse, does that have resonance today?
I think it has enormous resonance today, and I think it has enormous resonance today beyond the Orthodox or even the Jewish world. I think young people are very focused on the post-millennial young people are very focused on how do we build a life that makes sense? How do we get, it's not even how do we get to have it all, how do we achieve, I'll use my own phrase, how do we achieve shlemut? How do we have the pieces come together in a way that we live a life that makes sense and that matters? I think this is a generation that very much wants to matter. I think in Dr. Revel's thoughts was the notion that a Torah Umada L'Chatchila kind of vision was where we were supposed to go. It's what made him such a unique individual. I think he was very taken with the notion of the Jew as Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, and therefore that we had a need to know where we were transacting in the world and how we were contributing to it. I don't think that's lost. I think that's waiting to be tapped.
So I would agree. I think I would put what young people are looking for, just with a slightly different word, but maybe the same concept, which is they're looking for meaning.
Okay.
And they're finding that meaning in a variety of different ways. And one of our tasks as Jewish educators, I think, is to make sure that that meaning is found through the prism of Judaism. And I think a lot of the meaning that they're searching for and a lot of meaning that can be found is indeed from Jewish origins, but it's not always identified as such. And the idea of living life with a purpose, the idea of serving other human beings, the idea of being a good citizen to fellow human beings, in addition to fellow Jews, is an integral part of Jewish values. And I think you're absolutely right. To some extent, that's where Revel was going. And it's become as important today as it was then. And living a life of cognitive dissonance is tougher than living a life of unified meaning, when you could take Jewish values and your values as a human being and bring them together. And I think that's what we need to strive for, and something that I think we sometimes lose a bit in focusing on minutia and details and minor points. I don't think we teach enough of that, of values and spirituality. And I think we have to find a way to do better if we're going to continue to engage the next generation.
I think that I would differ with both President Joel and Dr. Kadish, because Dr. Revel here is not talking just generally about a search or a quest for meaning. It seems to me like he's talking about a particular kind of intellectual openness to the ideas and learning of the broader world, and being comfortable bringing that into conversation with one's Judaism and one's Torah knowledge and inhabiting that. And I see this may be reflective of broader phenomena of the decline of humanities and the rise of business majors. But I see many young adults in the both yeshivish Orthodox and modern Orthodox world who would like to get through college as quickly as possible, to get a degree that renders them employable as quickly as possible, neither with a great deal of interest in engaging with the deep questions and big ideas of the human condition as explored in broader Western academia, and often not with an interest either in trying to bring Torah points of view to bear on those things, because they would rather not encounter anything that they consider to be antithetical to a Torah point of view, rather than say, here's this and here's that, and those things are complicated or in conflict, or how do they talk to each other, and what do I do with them? I see an enormous amount of quest for meaning in other ways, in interest in spirituality and various modes of spirituality. Things sometimes get lumped under the general heading of neo-Chassidut. But I don't, again, and the reason why we don't see so much interest in the world of general studies ideas in the humanities and even the social sciences might in part be a reflection of broader phenomena in the world. Again, it might in part be a reflection of some of the things I talked about all the way in the beginning, which is the sense that it's coming down in many ways, whether it's from rabbinic leadership here, whether it's from programs there in Israel, that exposure to these kinds of ideas is treif or threatening or problematic. And it seems to me that there are many young adults in our communities who are comfortable going through training to be prepared for a profession, and actually not wanting to be pushed and challenged in the difficult or uncomfortable way of engaging what in SAR High School we don't call it Torah Umada or Torah Derech Eretz or Torah Vavodah. We call it the grand conversation between Torah and the world. But that same idea. And I don't know. I think some of us in the particular corner of the educational field that I'm in, one of the questions we ask ourselves is that something that has to be, or is it just like it speaks to us and it's a value to us, so we would like our kids to want to do it, but maybe they don't want to do it. Maybe they want to engage in neo-Chassidut for their meaning and their religious value, and then they want to just get a college degree and get a job. And maybe wrestling with the way that, literature or history makes us think about Judaism, maybe that's not something that actually every Jew needs to do. It's something that speaks to some of us and not others of us. And trying to get young adults today to want to do that, who aren't inclined to do that, is that a value that we really should be pushing hard and educating towards? Or is that's how we connect Jewishly, that's how we make meaning Jewishly, and maybe other young adults will do it in different ways that don't include that?
I would argue that the decline or the challenge to the liberal arts today is not a Jewish phenomenon alone. In fact, and a lot of it is because of the economic realities where people are worried about things that I didn't worry about in my generation, making a living. We knew we would, we just didn't know in which direction. And I think that pressure is on us. I also want to say, I don't want to cast stones, but we should cast stones on all of us. The real question is, look, the school is the second most important institution that our children have. The most important one, right, is our home. And it gets back to what do we talk about at the Shabbos table? And to what degree students are, and always one of the things about us is that we had those kind of greater conversations, even, and maybe even more, the non-religious view. And that's also why, and Dr. Revel spoke of it as well, the notion of being a complete Jew is not just what kind of an education you're getting, but what community are you in? When I was at Hillel, I used to give speeches, the theme of which was, if you want your child to have a Jewish background, you have to give them a Jewish playground. And part of the question is, what's the playground? And what are we talking about? I teach a class at Yeshiva Undergraduate on leadership. And first of all, it's wonderful and amazing to see how many, if you read all the leadership gurus, how easy it is to extrapolate from anybody's views and Torah principles, because there's so much overlap in that. But I also see in these students that they're kind of sitting there waiting to be given permission to feel inspired. And I generally don't, I like meaning better than spirituality because I don't know what a disembodied spirituality is. But I think what we do is challenge young people on these things. They're not going to walk away. Most of them haven't rejected anything. We've just been silent in communicating with them.
So I think you've correctly highlighted, I think both of you, the pressures that young people feel they're on today, particularly with some of the conformity of values. And there's certainly been a decline in the humanities. I've had the unusual experience of living in 7 different Jewish communities. And I think that's given me the perspective that this idea of engagement with the liberal arts and engagement with broader society, not on a purely professional basis, but on an intellectual basis, is one of the biggest differences. In fact, I would argue perhaps the only difference that I've seen in the different places that I've lived. And I think it's very much community dependent, which gets back to Richard Joel's point about how we're one of 2 pillars that are important. I don't know how to restore more thinking about the liberal arts to young people who feel pressure from different sides. We have some creative ideas. We try to engage. I think people are looking for things, but sometimes the reality of life, of timing, of economics, of family, of expectations helps thwart that a bit. And whether or not it's worth let me take a step back. I think if we think about education and engaging students, and Revel had a grand vision, but I think what I've learned in seeing young people now is that different people respond to different things. There's a group of young people who are very excited by this synthesis idea, but as RIvka pointed out, it's not everyone. There are those whom a search for meaning in life is important. There are those for whom a spirituality is important. And I think the most important thing that I've learned in the last few years is that if you want to reach the next generation, you have to be flexible in your approach. For some people, spending 6 hours a day learning Gemara is the way they relate to Judaism and the way they relate to intellectual activity. And for others, it's not enough. And I think if we try to create a cookie cutter approach, we are in danger of losing people. And that's one of the things that's a big challenge, because individualized attention is not easy in a large institution, but it's something that I think we've got to try. And we've got to create pathways for each student to find his way in the way that they are spoken to by Judaism and by values.
I don't think that we're saying much different. Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, already alerted us in the late 80s to the rise of business schools. I didn't think we would go this way, but what everybody's been really meditating over, something that my teacher, Jonathan Sarna, wrote about in the 80s while doing a study of the Wexner graduate fellowship program. He talked about being groomed and blooming. grooming and blooming. And we all groom and we all bloom, and we all want to make meaning. It's a question of where we do it. He's obviously forget about Israel and the rise of the state or in 1967, but President Revel didn't have to reckon with the years in Israel, which is where many young people make meaning, and they're there for 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes now 5 years. And that's where they're making their meaning. Maybe it's at shul, maybe it's in the home, but there is a need for all human beings to really make meaning in some way. And just sort of where we find that place and where we bloom is where eventually we're groomed. I want to, though, since this is biographical, I do want to talk about November 19th, 1940. President Revel is giving the Yoredea Shir to Smicha students, and he has a brain hemorrhage. None of his parents lived very long, and at 55, he didn't live much longer than they had. He must have understood what was going on. This is a passage that's reprinted in the Commentator, in the Yeshiva College Student newspaper for many years after Revel passes. He leaves his discourse of Yoredea, and he looks at his students, probably couldn't see if he had a brain hemorrhage. My life's work. My life is yeshiva. And the students are yeshiva. And yeshiva, the students. You and all who came before you, and those who shall come after you, are my life. And this is what he said before he would pass. Even if someone would deter you from the task I have set before you, tell him in my name that you must continue. The yeshiva is yours to build. Those were the last words that were offered by President Revel. Yeah.
So I want to put a capstone on that, though, because when he says, when he talks about how important and the centrality of the yeshiva is, I don't think he's using the same language and meaning that people use today, talking about the yeshiva as destination. I think for Dr. Revel, the purpose of a yeshiva education was to launch people. It wasn't to take a refuge. It was to develop that dualism of your values and your life knowledge in such a way that you become a complete Jewish personality and then bring that to bear. So in some ways, my point is, he's very much an educator. He sees the college as not a destination, but it's a pathway, and it has a job to do. And it's not just to help the student find a sense of meaning, but to help the student have the knowledge and the challenge and the experience and the wisdom to say, okay, now who am I? And I'm going to go on into life and do that. To me, that's always seemed as the essence of Dr. Revel. And that's why his concern was for the community, for day school education, and for how the graduates of yeshiva were going to impact on the community.
Right, and it's obviously much larger than just yeshiva.
Right.
But it's all the schools that we represent. It's much larger than Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Jews. It's American Jews. It's just Jews. And those are very apt terms. It's yours to build. He built something. And as we've seen, it gets messy. America and Americanism gets in the way. But it's been fabulous. We've once again gone over time. I don't want to hold you, all three of you, any longer, but thank you so much again, President Richard Joel, President Alan Kadish, Dr. Rivka Schwartz. This is fabulous. Thank you so much.
All the best to you.
It's been a pleasure.
Well done, a pleasure.
We're far apart, but we're getting closer together.
Yeah, with climate change, we're coming very close.
Very good. Take care. Thank you so much, all of you.
You're very welcome.